The last Halloween. I never liked Halloween. Sure, when I was a kid, it was fun, costumes, candy, and the thrill of the spooky night. But as I got older, the charm faded. Maybe it was because my town took Halloween too seriously. People here didn't just celebrate, they obsessed over it. Every house was decorated, every yard filled with fake gravestones, and every costume seemed to try and outdo the last. But that Halloween night was different. It was the night when everything went wrong. The evening started with a dare. My best friend, Corey, had heard about an old legend that made its way through our town every October. The story was simple. Somewhere in the woods behind our neighborhood, there was a house. They called it the Hollow House. No one knew who lived there or if anyone ever had, but it was said that anyone who went inside didn't come out the same, if they came out at all. Corey, being Corey, thought it would be hilarious to check it out. "Come on, Jake," he said, his grin full of mischief. "It's Halloween. What's scarier than a real haunted house? I don't know, maybe the fact that people disappear?" I shot back. "You're scared," he teased, and that's all it took. I couldn't let Corey think I was scared, even if every part of me screamed not to go. We waited until the trick-or-treaters had thinned out and the streets were quiet. Corey grabbed flashlights from his garage, and we set off into the woods. The moon was nearly full, casting an eerie glow over the trees. The farther we went, the more the sounds of the neighborhood faded. Soon, it was just the crunch of leaves under our feet and the occasional hoot of an owl. "Are we even going the right way?" I asked after what felt like an hour of walking. Corey didn't answer immediately. He was staring at something ahead, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. "There," he said, his voice low. I followed his gaze and felt a chill run down my spine. Ahead of us was a house, its silhouette looming against the night sky. It was exactly like the stories described, old, decrepit, and utterly wrong. The windows were dark, the porch sagged under the weight of decay, and the front door hung slightly ajar. "I told you it was real," Corey whispered, grinning. "I don't think this is a good idea," I said, my voice barely audible. "You wanted to prove you weren't scared, right?" Corey nudged me. "Let's take a look. We'll be in and out." The moment we stepped onto the porch, the air changed. It was colder, heavier, like the house was breathing around us. Corey pushed the door open with a loud creak, and the smell hit us. Damp wood, mildew, and something metallic. "Hello," Corey called out, his voice echoing unnaturally. No answer. We stepped inside, our flashlights cutting through the thick darkness. The house was worse than I imagined. The walls were covered in faded wallpaper that peeled like dead skin. The floors creaked under our weight, and the air was thick with dust. "This place is a dump," Corey said, shining his light on an old portrait hanging crooked on the wall. The face in the picture was blurred, as if someone had smudged it with their fingers. "Can we go now?" I asked, my voice trembling. "Not yet," Corey said. "We need to at least find something cool. Otherwise, what's the point?" We moved deeper into the house, and that's when things started happening. It began with the sound, soft at first, like footsteps coming from the floor above us. "Did you hear that?" I whispered. Corey nodded, his flashlight trembling in his hand. "Probably just the wind," he said, though he didn't sound convinced. The footsteps grew louder, heavier, and then stopped. "Hello," Corey called out again. The silence that followed was suffocating. Then, without warning, the door behind us slammed shut. Corey swore under his breath, spinning around. "It's just the wind," he repeated, but his voice cracked. We tried the door, but it wouldn't budge. It felt like something was pressing against it from the other side. "This isn't funny," I said, panic creeping into my voice. "Let's check upstairs," Corey said. "Maybe there's another way out." The staircase groaned under our weight as we climbed. The upper floor was even worse, colder, darker, and somehow more oppressive. There were 3 doors, all slightly ajar, each leading into pitch-black rooms. Corey chose the first door on the left. Inside was a bedroom, the furniture covered in white sheets that looked like they hadn't been touched in decades. "Look," he said, pointing to the bed. On the mattress was a single item, A jack-o'-lantern, its face twisted into a grotesque grin. Its candle flickered faintly, even though there was no flame. "Okay, that's creepy," I said. "Can we go now?" Corey ignored me, moving toward the next room. I stayed close, every nerve in my body on edge. The second room was empty, save for a mirror leaning against the far wall. Corey shone his flashlight on it, and we both froze. In the reflection, we weren't alone. A figure stood between us, tall, thin, and cloaked in shadow. Its face was obscured, but its eyes glowed faintly, like embers. I turned around, but there was nothing there. "Let's get out of here," I whispered, grabbing Corey's arm. But Corey wasn't listening. He was staring into the mirror, his face pale. "It's moving," he said. The figure in the mirror stepped closer, its head tilting unnaturally as it studied us. And then it smiled. We bolted, running down the hall and back toward the stairs. But when we reached the top of the staircase, the house changed. The steps were gone, replaced by a yawning void that seemed to stretch endlessly downward. "What the hell is going on?" Corey shouted. The footsteps returned, this time from behind us. I turned and saw them, figures emerging from the shadows, their faces distorted and wrong. "Run!" I screamed, pulling Corey toward one of the remaining doors. We stumbled into a room and slammed the door behind us. There was no lock, so we pressed our weight against it, our breathing ragged. "What do we do?" Corey whispered, his eyes wide with terror. "I don't know," I said, my voice shaking. The door rattled as something on the other side pushed against it. And then, everything went quiet. We stayed frozen, waiting, but the silence stretched on. Finally, Corey peeked through the crack of the door. "They're gone," he whispered. We stepped out cautiously, our flashlights shaking. The hallway was empty, but the air felt heavier, thicker. "This way," Corey said, leading me toward the end of the hall. The last door opened into a staircase that spiraled downward. It didn't look like it belonged in the house, too clean, too pristine. But it was our only option. We descended, the steps seeming to go on forever. The air grew colder, the walls narrower, until finally we reached the bottom. It wasn't an exit. It was a room. A massive circular space lit by dozens of flickering jack-o'-lanterns. In the center stood a figure, cloaked in shadow. "Welcome," it said, its voice low and echoing. "What do you want?" Corey demanded, his voice trembling. The figure tilted its head. "You came to my house," it said. "Now you'll never leave." The jack-o'-lanterns flared, their twisted faces grinning as the shadows closed in. The last thing I remember is Corey's scream, and then nothing. When I woke up, it was morning. I was lying in the woods, alone. The house was gone, and so was Corey. The Lantern's Curse. Halloween had always been my favorite holiday. There was something magical about the way the world felt that night, drenched in darkness but alive with energy. This year, however, was different. It would be the Halloween I'd never forget. It began with a dare. Every year, my friends and I had a tradition, the Halloween Challenge. Each year, someone would choose a location rumored to be haunted, and we'd spend the night there. This time, it was an abandoned farmhouse on the edge of town. The story behind it was vague. Something about a family disappearing one Halloween night decades ago. People whispered that the house was cursed, but nobody really knew why. "Come on, Sam," Jake said, his voice laced with that smug confidence that always got under my skin. "You're not going to back out, are you?" "I'm not scared," I replied, even though I was. I wasn't about to let Jake or anyone else think I was a coward. That's how I found myself standing outside the farmhouse at 11 p.m. on Halloween night, flashlight in hand, the cold October wind biting at my skin. The house loomed before us, a decaying monument to everything wrong in the world. Its windows were shattered, its porch sagging under the weight of neglect. The front door hung slightly ajar, creaking softly as the wind pushed against it. "It's just a house," Sarah said, trying to sound brave. "What's the worst that could happen?" Jake smirked. Famous last words. We stepped inside, the floorboards groaning beneath our weight. The air was thick with the smell of mildew and rot. Our flashlights cast long, flickering shadows on the walls, making the peeling wallpaper look like it was moving. "Okay," Jake said, turning to face us. "The rules are simple. We split up, search the house, and meet back here in an hour." I didn't like the idea, but I didn't want to be the one to protest. So we all went our separate ways. I chose the staircase, though every step felt like a terrible decision. The stairs creaked loudly, each one sounding like a warning. By the time I reached the second floor, my palms were slick with sweat. The upstairs hallway was narrow and suffocating, lined with closed doors. I picked the one at the end, drawn by some inexplicable pull. The room was small, with a single window that looked out over the overgrown yard. In the center of the room was a table, and on the table was a lantern. It wasn't like any lantern I'd ever seen before. Its base was wrought iron, twisted into intricate patterns, and its glass panels were tinted a deep crimson. I couldn't explain why, but the sight of it made my chest tighten. I stepped closer, reaching out a trembling hand to touch it. The moment my fingers brushed the iron, the flame inside the lantern flickered to life. I jumped back, nearly dropping my flashlight. "What the? Do you like it?" a voice said behind me. I spun around, but there was no one there. "Who's there?" I demanded, my voice shaking. The room was empty, yet I could feel a presence. Something heavy, something watching. Downstairs, I heard a crash, followed by Sarah's scream. Without thinking, I bolted for the stairs, my flashlight beam bouncing wildly. When I reached the living room, I found Sarah standing in the middle of the room, her face pale and her eyes wide. "What happened?" I asked. "The mirror," she stammered, pointing to a shattered frame on the floor. "I saw something." "Where's Jake?" I asked, looking around. "He went into the basement," she said, her voice trembling. "But he hasn't come back." Against every instinct screaming at me to leave, I opened the door to the basement. The stairs were steep and narrow, leading into a suffocating darkness. The air was colder down there, and it carried a metallic tang that made me think of blood. "Jake?" I called out, my voice echoing in the void. No answer. I descended slowly, my flashlight cutting through the dark. At the bottom of the stairs, I found him, or what was left of him. Jake was sitting in the middle of the floor, his back to me. At first, I thought he was just sitting still, but as I got closer, I realized he wasn't breathing. His head lolled to one side, and his eyes stared blankly into nothingness. The worst part was his mouth. It was open, frozen in a silent scream, and inside was wax. Thick, black wax that seemed to be pouring from his throat. I stumbled back, nearly tripping over my own feet. "Run," Jake's voice whispered, though his body didn't move. I turned and bolted up the stairs, slamming the door shut behind me. "We need to go," I gasped, grabbing Sarah's arm. "He's..." I couldn't finish the sentence. "What do you mean?" Sarah asked, her voice rising. "Where is he?" "He's dead," I said. The words hung heavy in the air. Before Sarah could respond, the lantern appeared on the table in the living room. I didn't see anyone place it there. It was just there. Its crimson glow pulsed, casting eerie shadows on the walls. "We have to leave," I said, pulling Sarah toward the door. But the door wouldn't open. "It's locked," Sarah cried, tugging at the handle. "No," I said, my heart pounding. "It's not locked. It's the house. It won't let us leave." The lantern's light grew brighter, almost blinding. And then, one by one, the shadows it cast began to move. They peeled away from the walls, forming figures, twisted, in human shapes with glowing red eyes. "Stay behind me," I told Sarah, though I had no idea what I was going to do. The figures advanced slowly, their movements jerky and unnatural. "Why are you doing this?" I shouted, my voice cracking. "You lit the lantern," a voice replied, deep and guttural. "Now you're part of the curse." "I didn't mean to," I said, desperation clawing at my chest. "It doesn't matter," the voice said. "The lantern chooses. The lantern consumes, I grabbed Sarah's hand and bolted for the kitchen. If the front door was blocked, maybe there was another way out. The kitchen was in worse shape than the rest of the house, with mold crawling up the walls and rusted appliances scattered across the floor. But there was a back door. We ran to it, but just as I reached for the handle, the lantern appeared on the counter beside me. Its crimson light flared, and I felt a searing pain in my chest. I dropped to my knees, gasping for air. Felt like my heart was being ripped apart from the inside. "Sam!" Sarah screamed, grabbing my shoulders. "Go," I choked out. "Just go." But she didn't leave. She stayed, trying to pull me to my feet. The last thing I saw was the lantern's light engulfing us, its glow burning into my mind like a brand. When I woke up, it was morning. I was lying in the middle of the field where the farmhouse had been, but the house was gone. So was Sarah. The only thing left was the lantern, sitting next to me, its crimson glow faint but unyielding. I can't get rid of it. I've tried smashing it, burning it, even throwing it into a river. It always comes back. And every Halloween, its light grows brighter. I know what it wants, and I know one day it'll take me too. The Night of Masks. Halloween had always been my favorite time of the year. The crisp air, the glowing jack-o'-lanterns, and the thrill of dressing up to become someone, or something, else for one night. But this Halloween wasn't about candy or costumes. It was about proving I wasn't a coward. Started with a text from my best friend, Ethan. "Meet at the old McAllister house. 11 p.m. Bring a flashlight. Don't back out." The McAllister house was infamous in our town. Abandoned for decades, it sat at the end of a dead-end road, surrounded by overgrown fields and twisted trees. Stories of hauntings and disappearances had turned it into a local legend, the kind of place you dared each other to visit but never actually did. Until now. I didn't want to go, but backing out wasn't an option. Ethan had been calling me a chicken ever since I refused to join him in last year's haunted hayride. This was my chance to prove him wrong. I arrived a little past 11. The McAllister house loomed ahead, its windows like hollow eyes staring into the night. The moonlight barely reached the property, casting the house in deep shadows. Ethan's car was parked nearby, but there was no sign of him. "Ethan?" I called out, my breath visible in the cold air. No answer. Clutching my flashlight, I made my way to the front porch. The wood creaked under my weight, and the door, slightly ajar, groaned as I pushed it open. "Ethan, this isn't funny," I said, stepping inside. The air was thick with the smell of mildew and something faintly metallic. The house was deathly silent except for the occasional groan of the wind outside. "Over here," Ethan's voice echoed from somewhere deeper in the house. Relieved, I followed the sound, my flashlight cutting through the darkness. I found Ethan in the living room, standing next to an old, dust-covered table. On it was a single object, a plain white mask with hollow eye sockets and no features except for a faintly painted smile. "About time you showed up," Ethan said, smirking. "What the hell is this?" I asked, gesturing to the mask. "It's part of the game," he said. "I found it here when I got in. You wouldn't believe what else is in this house. It's like a time capsule." "I don't like this," I said, shivering despite myself. "Relax," Ethan said. "It's just a mask. Let's look around, take some pictures, and get out of here." "Easy." We split up to explore. The house was in worse shape than I expected. The wallpaper peeled in long strips, revealing warped wood beneath. Furniture sat where it had been left, now covered in dust and cobwebs. In one room, I found a child's rocking horse, its paint faded and cracked. The sight of it made my stomach twist. "Ethan, I think we should leave," I called out, my voice shaky. "Come check this out first." His voice came from upstairs. Against my better judgment, I climbed the stairs, each step groaning under my weight. At the top, I found Ethan in a bedroom. He was holding the mask, turning it over in his hands. "This thing is weird," he said. "It feels warm." "Put it down," I said, unease crawling up my spine. Ethan grinned and, before I could stop him, slipped the mask over his face. Tata, he said, his voice muffled. Creepy, right? Take it off, I said, my heart pounding. He didn't respond. Ethan? He stood there, his body rigid, the mask's hollow eyes staring at me. Take it off, I shouted, reaching for him. The moment my hand touched his arm, he snapped his head toward me. But it wasn't Ethan anymore. The thing wearing his body let out a low, guttural laugh, sending ice through my veins. Its movements were jerky, almost mechanical, as it stepped toward me. Ethan, this isn't funny, I said, backing away. It tilted its head, the painted smile on the mask twisting into something far more sinister. Ethan's not here anymore, it said, its voice layered with something deeper, darker. I turned and bolted down the stairs, my flashlight bouncing wildly. The house seemed to change as I ran. The walls felt closer, the air heavier. I could hear footsteps behind me, slow and deliberate. I reached the front door and yanked it open, only to find myself staring into the same hallway I had just fled. What the hell? I whispered, my breath coming in short gasps. The house was toying with me, trapping me in its endless maze. Every door I opened led back inside. Every staircase looped me around to places I'd already been. And the thing wearing Ethan's body was always there, its hollow eyes watching, waiting. Why are you doing this? I screamed, spinning to face it. The thing tilted its head again. It's Halloween, it said, its voice dripping with malice. Time to play. I ran until my legs burned, ducking into a room and slamming the door shut behind me. The room was filled with masks, hundreds of them hanging on the walls, each one more grotesque than the last. Some had twisted grins, others screaming mouths, and others were eerily blank. In the center of the room was a single chair. On it sat a mask identical to the one Ethan had put on. The door rattled behind me, and I knew I didn't have much time. Desperation took over. I grabbed the mask from the chair, hoping, praying, it would give me some kind of leverage. The door burst open, and the thing stepped inside, its movements slow and deliberate. You can't leave, it said, but you can join us. It lunged, and I did the only thing I could think of. I shoved the mask over its face. The world seemed to implode. The house groaned as if it were alive, the walls twisting and buckling. The thing screamed, its voice splitting into 1,000 echoes, each more horrifying than the last. And then silence. I woke up in the field outside the McAllister house, the first rays of dawn breaking over the horizon. Ethan's car was gone. So was the house. But the mask, it was still there, lying next to me. I tried to leave it behind, but no matter where I went, it always found its way back to me. And every Halloween, I hear the whispers. The masks are waiting. The Carnival of Shadows. Halloween night always had a way of transforming our small town. Streets lined with glowing jack-o'-lanterns, children dressed in costumes, and that faint, crisp scent of autumn hanging in the air. But this year was different. It wasn't the decorations or the costumes that caught my attention. It was the flyer, bright red ink on faded paper, pinned to the town's notice board. The Carnival of Shadows, Halloween night only. Midnight, at the old fairgrounds. The old fairgrounds had been abandoned for as long as I could remember. Once a place of laughter and joy, it now stood as a decaying relic of the past, shrouded in rumors of hauntings and mysterious disappearances. Most people avoided it, but the flyer promised something different. A night of thrills and frights for those brave enough to attend. It's probably just some teenagers pulling a prank, my best friend, Emma, had said earlier that evening. Or maybe it's a real carnival, I replied. What if it's a one-night-only thing? Something special? She rolled her eyes. You're too curious for your own good, Mark. But fine, I'll go with you. Just don't expect me to love it if we're the only ones there. At 11:45, we parked Emma's car near the entrance to the old fairgrounds. The place was as eerie as I'd imagined, silent and dark, with the skeletal remains of old rides barely visible in the moonlight. But then, in the distance, we saw lights. A faint glow shimmered through the mist, and as we walked closer, the sounds of carnival music drifted through the air. The melody was strange, slightly off-key, as though being played on an ancient, broken organ. "I don't like this," Emma whispered, gripping my arm. "It's just part of the act," I said, trying to sound confident. But even I couldn't ignore the unease crawling up my spine. The carnival itself was unlike anything I'd ever seen. Strings of dim, flickering lights hung haphazardly between rusting poles. The booths were dilapidated, their paint peeling, but they were manned by figures in elaborate masks. Each one offered games and prizes, though the rules were whispered in voices too soft to hear. "Welcome," a voice said behind us, startling both of us. We turned to see a tall man in a top hat and a black coat. His face was obscured by a porcelain mask, its expression frozen in a wide, unsettling grin. "You've come to play, haven't you?" Emma hesitated, but I nodded. "What is this place?" "The Carnival of Shadows," he said, spreading his arms as if presenting us a grand gift. "A place for those who seek excitement and fear. But be warned. Every game comes with a cost." His voice sent shivers down my spine, but there was something intoxicating about the atmosphere. "Let's just look around," Emma said, pulling me toward the nearest booth. The first game was simple enough, a ring toss. The prize was a small stuffed bear, and the masked attendance instructions were vague, muttered in a language I didn't recognize. Emma gave it a try, but the rings seemed to veer away from the bottles, no matter how well she aimed. Frustrated, she handed me a ring. "Your turn," she said. I tossed it, and to my surprise, it landed perfectly. "Congratulations," the attendant said in a hollow voice, handing me the bear. It was heavier than I expected, and when I looked closer, I realized its button eyes weren't buttons at all. They were real eyes, glassy and unblinking. I dropped it immediately, my stomach turning. "Mark, what's wrong?" Emma asked. "Nothing," I lied, wiping my hands on my jeans. "Let's move on." The deeper we ventured into the carnival, the stranger it became. The air felt thicker, heavier, and the games grew more sinister. One booth offered a fortune-telling session, but the crystal ball showed images of people screaming in the dark. Another had a guessing game where the jars were filled with what looked suspiciously like human teeth. "This isn't right," Emma said, her voice trembling. "We need to leave." She was right, but when we turned to retrace our steps, the path was gone. The booths had shifted, forming a labyrinth of tents and shadowy corridors. "Where's the entrance?" I muttered, panic rising. The music grew louder, more discordant, as if mocking us. "Lost, are we?" The man in the top hat appeared again, his mask grinning wider than before. "We want to leave," Emma said, her voice firm. "Leave?" He chuckled, a sound that echoed unnaturally. "The only way out is to win." "Win what?" I asked. He didn't answer. Instead, he gestured toward a large, tattered tent at the center of the carnival. "You'll find your answer there." With no other choice, we walked toward the tent, its flaps billowing as though alive. Inside, the air was suffocating. A single spotlight illuminated a circular stage, and in the center was a large wheel, like the kind you'd see at a circus. But this wheel wasn't painted with cheerful colors. Its sections were black and red, each inscribed with strange symbols. The man in the top hat appeared again, this time holding a long, thin cane. "Spin the wheel," he said. "What happens if we don't?" Emma asked, her voice trembling. "You stay here," he said simply. Emma looked at me, her eyes pleading. I stepped forward, my hands shaking, and grabbed the edge of the wheel. With one deep breath, I gave it a spin. The wheel spun faster than it should have, the symbols blurring together into a hypnotic spiral. When it finally slowed, it stopped on a section marked with a jagged symbol that looked like a broken crown. The man in the top hat clapped his hands. The game of leadership. Will you rise or will you fall?" Before I could ask what he meant, the floor beneath me vanished. I fell into darkness, landing hard in a cold, stone chamber. The walls were lined with mirrors, each one reflecting not my face, but twisted versions of myself. Grinning, snarling, screaming. "Mark!" Emma's voice echoed, but I couldn't see her. "I'm here!" I shouted back, but my voice seemed swallowed by the mirrors. The man's laughter filled the space, and the mirrors began to shatter one by one, each breaking into 1,000 shards. When the last mirror shattered, I found myself back in the tent. Emma was beside me, her face pale and tear-streaked. "You've won the first game," the man said, his tone almost congratulatory. "What now?" I demanded. "Now you play again." The wheel spun without me touching it, the symbols blurring together once more. "Mark, I don't think we're getting out of this," Emma whispered, clutching my arm. The wheel stopped and the man smiled. "Ah, the game of truth. Let's see how honest you are." The night stretched endlessly, each game more harrowing than the last. The carnival twisted our fears, forcing us to confront nightmares we never knew we had. When it was finally over, we found ourselves outside the old fairgrounds, the sun rising on the horizon. But something was wrong. Emma wouldn't speak. Her eyes were blank, her expression empty. And when I looked into the rearview mirror, my reflection wasn't my own. The Carnival of Shadows was gone, but its mark remained. Every Halloween, I hear its music in the distance, calling me back. And I know one day, I'll have no choice but to answer.